The Supreme Court debates whether to uphold a law that would lead to a ban of TikTok. Now, if the bill stands, the China-based social media app will either need to find new owners by January 19th or be blacklisted in the U.S. from app stores and web browsing. TikTok making the case that a potential ban violates the First Amendment right to free speech. The U.S. government expresses security concerns for the social media app's ties to China. Here's what TikTok lawyer Noel Francisco had to argue at the Supreme Court hearing.
The government's real target, rather, is the speech itself. Its fear that Americans, even if fully informed, could be persuaded by Chinese misinformation. That, however, is a decision that the First Amendment leaves to the people.
For more on the potential fallout, we've got Cornell University Director of the Tech Policy Institute, Sarah Krebs. Thank you so much for being here, Professor. So as we look at this, what looks like the Supreme Court upholding this ban, in your view, why do you think that they did not necessarily find TikTok's arguments persuasive?
Yeah, it's interesting that the poly markets and the consensus already has emerged that the courts did not find it persuasive, because I think it was a kind of case that, and I listened to all 2.5 hours, that when I first heard the first part of the hearings, I felt like the TikTok lawyers really took a beating. But I think the justices were also somewhat concerned, very concerned about the question of the First Amendment. But having said that, I think what the basis of this case is really about the content versus the ownership. And the First Amendment does not apply to foreign ownership, even if the TikTok lawyers are saying that, yes, it applies to the American content creators. That's a different argument than what the Supreme Court justices and the government were making about foreign adversary ownership of ByteDance ownership of TikTok.
And so, Sarah, given all that, and as Julie's pointing out, that the reports seem to indicate that the Supreme Court voiced skepticism here. But if you were to take your bet, you ultimately think the Supreme Court decides what here, Sarah?
I would, having expressed some skepticism about the consensus, the reason why I think that the court will actually uphold the law isn't necessarily about my reading of today, although I do think that the justices in that first part were surprisingly kind of one mind, and which is unusual in an era of polarization. And so there was, I think, that skepticism and that deference to national security. So I would expect, though, that they will uphold it. And I think that has more to do not with today's arguments, as much as historical precedent, which is the courts, in this 2010 case, Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project, which was cited today, the Supreme Court Chief Justice said that this is not a matter, that the courts are not well-versed in national security, and they don't want to have to adjudicate those kinds of decisions. So they generally will defer. And I think having heard today's arguments, where there's that really complex tapestry of technology, of national security, of the First Amendment, and the bipartisan consensus in both the House and the Congress, and the unanimous decision by the lower court, that all seems to point in the direction of the Supreme Court upholding this law.
And so does TikTok have any other recourse at this point?
Yeah, so they got to that in the last part of the hearing. So what happens? So the TikTok lawyer said, well, yes, we're going to go dark on January 20th. But I don't think this will be the last word. I think there is this sense, and this was brought up in the hearings today, is this just, the Solicitor General said she thinks that this is just, they're playing a chicken game, which is they're waiting for the government to blink, hoping that the courts will blink, and if not, then they're going to unveil some sort of quick divestment strategy on January 20th. So I think that's what would happen next, and then we'd be in the next chapter. I'm sort of skeptical that that TikTok will just go away on January 20th. I think that this was just kind of the most recent chapter in this saga.
Another chapter, Sarah, of course, is the Trump chapter. And his sort of thinking about TikTok has evolved, Sarah, right? Because he was a critic of TikTok initially, but now it sounds like he would like to, if he had his way, kind of put a hold on all this until he moves back into the White House. What kind of power, what kind of legal authority does he have here, Sarah?
Well, his legal authority is not to come in and be able to just reverse this. That's not how it works. What could happen though, is that the Trump administration would be in a position to decide whether a possible divestment is adequate. So that then would go back to the president. And because of how complicated this is and this question of backdoors and the ownership, it's difficult. It's a difficult technical question, and that could give him some sort of that discretion to make that judgment about whether this divestment is adequate in terms of mitigating the national security risk.
Sarah, are there any implications for other Chinese-owned companies, or was this really just pertaining to TikTok?
No, it's a great question because this came up today in the hearings, which is, well, what about Temu? They have millions of Americans that they get click data from, and what about that? And that's a valid question, but I think was set aside as a difference in kind was the language that the Solicitor General kept using, the difference in kind from what we're talking about here, which is the 170 million Americans access to their data and ability to manipulate the psychology and opinion of those Americans.
Sarah Krebs, thank you very much. An important perspective today as we follow this story.
Thank you.